I'm speaking with David Church, author of Post Horror Art, Genre, and Cultural Elevation, published by Edinburgh University Press, February 28th, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, first, how did you get into studying this subject and writing a book on it?
Well, I've been sort of interested in this recent wave of horror films that seem to have gotten quite a bit of cultural buzz, and seem to be debated quite a lot by genre fans. So lots of fans are saying, "Oh, there's this new wave of films that are seemingly above the fray as far as kind of standing outside the norm of the horror genre. Films that seem to be a little more in sort of the art cinema mode."
Mhm.
And a lot of those films have gotten a lot more kind of mainstream and also highbrow critical buzz. But at the same time, some fans have become increasingly um, skeptical about some of the ways that um, highbrow critics have tried to reclaim these films as simply better than the average horror film.
Mhm.
So I was first I was first brought to this topic by the film It Follows,
Mhm.
which forms one of the chapters in this book.
Okay.
I was kind of blown away by it when I first saw it in 2016, I guess. And I went back and saw it over and over and thought, oh, something is really happening here. And around that same time was also when The Witch was released and a few other films.
Mhm.
And so there started to be a noticeable trend as far as a number of these films that seem to be a little more slow and minimalistic and ambiguous, and really seem to be more in sort of the art cinema mode,
Mhm.
but doing something with the horror genre nonetheless that seemed to be kind of striking.
Mhm. So tell me then, so actually I wanted to step back for just a moment and so when did you originally get into studying horror? I guess were you a fan when you were young and you just stuck with it?
Yeah, yeah, I've always been a horror fan ever since I was a kid, and watching the old, 30s Universal horror films and just kind of moving up from there.
Mhm.
Horror was not something that was really welcome in my household. My parents really have no interest in the genre and always kind of look down their nose at it.
Mhm.
And so I would always have to sort of go elsewhere to find it to kind of satisfy my interest in the genre.
Mhm.
But yeah, I grew up as a horror fan, and once I became an undergrad and went to college, I suddenly realized that, oh, there's this actual, you can actually study horror films, and there's this body of literature out there where people are actually taking these films seriously, including films that, to hear my parents talk about them would be, seemingly beneath contempt.
Yeah.
So so the idea that you could actually, take these films seriously and actually develop a serious body of research about them is something that I've always been fascinated by.
Mhm.
So, going into to further studies myself on through the master's and PhD, I've always been fascinated in lowbrow genres of various types. So not just horror films, but also exploitation films, adult films, basically any sort of genre that tends to be written off by society at large or seen as not really worthy of being remembered.
Mhm.
I'm always interested in like how these films, especially older films, are recirculated and how they're still framed as important in some way.
Mhm.
But this book was a little bit of a departure because it wasn't so much about older films being recirculated on home video or things like that. It was about recent films that were coming out over a short span of years. So
Mhm.
it was a little more focused as far as the time period I was looking at.
So what time period are you looking at in the book?
So primarily, 2013 and 2014 is when the first of these films start to come out.
Mhm.
You start to have some films like Under the Skin, the Babadook, and Goodnight Mommy. Those are three that start to get this critical conversation sort of forming gradually around them. And then the year after that, you have It Follows and The Witch, which kind of jump uh, from the art house circuit, or rather, they jumped from the festivals straight into multiplexes, which was something a little different than what happened with the Babadook and Goodnight Mommy, because those were still, they went from festivals into the art houses, but they didn't really get the mainstream visibility at least until they sort of moved to, Netflix and streaming platforms a couple years down the road.
Mhm.
But there was much more of a straight line from the festival premieres to the multiplex for It Follows and The Witch and The Black Coat's Daughter and a couple of other films that came out right around 2014, 2015, 2016. And
Mhm.
so that struck me as interesting because all of a sudden these films, which might have otherwise been seen as too sort of arty to be crossing over to the multiplex, are now starting to get in front of much broader audiences. And that's why I think they've been sort of, some of them have been pretty divisive as far as their overall reception. So, genre fans and professional film critics will tend to love these films, but then if you look at like Rotten Tomato scores and the more sort of like, I guess you could say, casual fans of horror, they come into these films thinking, oh, okay, this is playing at the multiplex, getting all this buzz, I'm going to go see it, and then they are kind of shocked or startled that it's, you're not getting a whole bunch of jump scares. They're usually kind of slow, disturbing, they're ambiguous, they don't necessarily spoon feed you all the narrative information that you might be expecting. So they're really sort of making viewers work harder than they might expect to have to work if they're just going and expecting it to be like a popcorn horror movie.
So were these films, and you can address all of them, how many of them were self-consciously trying to be more, elevate themselves, and which were just, hey, we're just trying to make different kinds of horror, new kinds of horror?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of them, the the filmmakers were either first time filmmakers or second time filmmakers. They were trying to sort of, make a name for themselves and kind of coming out of art schools or having a lot of inspiration themselves from sort of like the art house tradition.
Mhm.
Filmmakers like Bergman or Tarkovsky or Antonioni or whoever.
Mhm.
And so, these filmmakers, I think, deliberately did want to elevate their material. Um, Lots of them said, well, I was a horror fan, and being able to do this sort of heavily stylized and aestheticized treatment of horror was one way of making a name for myself and being able to get sort of a foothold in the industry to then make other sorts of films.
Mhm.
So if you look at somebody like Robert Eggers or Ari Aster with The Witch and Hereditary, those were their first feature films, but they were both, very very trained in film history and have a lot of highbrow influences. And they sort of said, well, these were my way of making a name for myself when I was crossing over, into the film world in a more substantial way.
Mhm.
Um, in other cases, it might have just been, we're doing something a little bit different. We're getting away from maybe some of the over reliance on jump scares or the over reliance on gore and shock effect and things like that. As
Mhm.
one thing that I mentioned in the book is that if you look at the longer history of the horror genre, at least in the US, it tends to have sort of like it's sort of a swinging pendulum where it'll move in a more sort of like graphic, gory, shock-oriented direction, which we kind of saw with like the torture porn films from, the immediate post 9/11 era. And then gradually there's been this move back toward the kind of paranormal ghost films, more gothic films that are a little more atmospheric and suggestive and not so much focused on like, blood and gore and guts and things like that.
Mhm.
So this seems to be a little more of like moving in that direction of visual restraint, at least with some of them.
So, and this might be a question outside beyond the scope of your book, but have you seen, has that, how is the streaming, how has that influenced sort of the approach to either horror films or horror shows or series?
hmm Um, I think streaming has definitely opened up a lot of new avenues um, for some of these films. So some of the films that I'm writing about in this particular book gained a much broader audience when they went to streaming. So something like The Babadook hadn't been seen by a huge number of people before it landed on Netflix, but once it landed on Netflix and was sort of humorously miscategorized as an LGBTQ film, it sort of gained this sort of semi-ironic cult reputation where all these people were saying, "Oh, the Babadook is now a queer icon" or something like that. So all these different ways that when these films move to streaming and get a broader audience, they can be taken up and gain sort of an interesting, different life of their own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think with the broader horror genre, one of the things that's been really interesting with the rise of streaming services is the rise of like anthology horror films.
Mhm.
So this idea that you have a film that's feature length, but it contains a number of bite-sized little mini films basically in it, little mini segmented bite-sized chunks of narrative. It's almost a form of horror film that's really made very well for streaming, because you can just sort of dip in or dip out and watch a little piece here, a little piece there. It's an interesting spin on what you might see with like the longer more serialized forms of horror that we see coming to streaming services as well, like the Haunting of Hill House or things of that nature.
I'm speaking with David Church, author of Post Horror. You can find more information about his work at david-church.com. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people, or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. So give me some examples of what you were talking about, this stuff that you can dip in and out of.
A film like XX, just all women-led anthology film, that would be an interesting example.
Mm-hmm.
So a film where it's framed in such a way where we're getting together a bunch of filmmakers. In this case, they're all women, and they all have their own stories, and we're basically bringing it all together under this feature-length umbrella, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all kind of following the same sort of like format as a movie like Creep Show or something like that, where there might be a little bit of a framing narrative in some way, and then they branch off into little individual stories, and then it might come back to the framing narrative at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Also, movies like the VHS series, that's something that over the last 10 years or so made use of this sort of anthologized format as well.
Mm. And this question is, I'm sure, outside the scope of your book, but you might have thoughts on it. Has this influenced horror video games at all? Do you know? Because there's, video games have become so cinematic in a sense.
That's a good question, because I don't focus too much on horror video games myself.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are certain video games that seem to be moving a little more in the direction of generating some of the dread that you might associate with some of the post-horror films.
Mm-hmm.
So like I can't remember what the name of it is. It's the Alien video game, where you basically have to run and hide from the alien at different points. That one strikes me as maybe doing something similar to some of these films, as far as there's a monster on the loose, but you hardly ever see it, and there's this constant sense of dread. It's not so much about the blood and guts and gore and all that kind of stuff, but it's about constantly making you feel this sense of tension.
Mm-hmm. What about do these films, I don't want to ask or I don't want to say they have lower production values, but are they cheaper because they don't have as much special effects or visual, if it's more about the story and feel and atmosphere? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of these films are lower budgeted. They are not necessarily coming from the major studios or having major studios distribute them. Right. So a lot of these films were produced by, like I mentioned, first-time or second-time filmmakers. They have more of an indie ethos behind them, and that might help to explain why they tend to get picked up by distributors like A24, which has a little more of an artsy kind of cultural cachet to it. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, though, I think because they aren't necessarily relying on a lot of big actors or lots of sets and CGI and special effects and all those things that might potentially amp up the budgets in a way that a major studio film might.
Mhm.
I think you do see that reflected to some degree within the films themselves. So a lot of the films will be set in a very limited number of locations. So they might be in these very claustrophobically gothic interiors, and dealing with family issues like unexpected loss, traumatic loss of a family member, especially a parent or child, seems to be a recurring motif in a lot of these films as a way of setting up whatever supernatural or possibly supernatural events happen as well.
Mhm.
And so, I think it makes sense that if you have at your disposal a limited number of sets, a limited number of actors, you're going to pare down the story into something that seems to be something that seems, easier to deal with. And getting down onto that sort of like intimate human level, you're focusing much more on the character psychology and really developing the characters rather than just delivering one scare after another.
Mhm. And I've noticed that with sci-fi films, these sort of indie popular ones that are more like maybe pared down in a sense and more focused on the feelings and the atmosphere. So
Yeah,
I'm just wondering if there's some parallel, some timeline, something within recent film history that suggests why both genres have been doing that.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's uh, partly the fact that the major studios have sort of like moved out from these indie divisions that they had around kind of the turn of the century,
Hmm.
where a lot of them were sort of like these indie wood divisions like Fox Searchlight and things like that. Well, I guess Fox Searchlight is still around, but a lot of the major studios had their own little indie distribution arms, and they've gradually sort of retracted from that. Most of those indie distribution arms under the major studios have folded, and so now it's gone back to these smaller distributors like A24, people who are sort of outside the studio system, who are the ones getting a lot of these projects off the ground.
Hmm.
And so I think it probably makes sense that then, as a result of that, you have any genre, whether that be sci-fi or horror, um, having to deal with smaller budgets and less access, and maybe trying to carve out more of a niche for themselves through the art house market. But of course, if they can take a film that seems very art house in style and then parlay that into getting some sort of a wider release in multiplexes, that seems to be something that some of the sci-fi and horror films have been able to do in recent years.
Hmm. So how we've touched a little bit on how what the book has in it. Can you talk about how it's laid out, how you break it down?
Sure, yeah. So the book begins by kind of looking at what this overall corpus is. Like, what is the body of films that I'm looking at? What are some of the general stylistic traits that they have?
Mhm.
So I'm looking at how they tend to generate this affect of dread. And they tend to be very ambiguous. They tend to be slow paced. Um, the way that they're filmed, there's not a whole lot of really like frenetic editing and cinematography. There's a lot of like kind of cold distance from what we're watching in a lot of these films.
Mhm.
So they can feel sort of off-putting when you're watching them potentially. Um, and yet at the same time, they are often dealing with these themes around trauma or gaslighting and so on that can strike people on really a sort of a deep personal level as well.
Mhm.
So in the first chapter, I'm basically trying to figure out, okay, what are these films? I'm trying to delimit a sort of working group of films that I'm talking about. And then in the second chapter, I'm dealing more with what are some of the historical influences on these films from the horror genre. So looking at precursors like The Shining or Rosemary's Baby or Don't Look Now, and using that as a way into trying to discuss how film critics have attempted or made multiple attempts to name these films, to sort of name them as some sort of cycle or subgenre, or find some way of like uh, marking them off as different than the average horror film. So
Mhm.
using terms like calling them indie horror or slow horror or smart horror or elevated horror or post horror, like these are all attempts to in some way say, okay, these are different than your average Hollywood style horror film. But one of the things that I do in that second chapter is basically say, okay, here are the reasons why these types of critical terms might have been applied to label these films, but then here are the reasons why those labels are ultimately flawed. And what I'm trying to sort of argue there is that the reason why there were so many successive attempts to try to label these films as something other than just straightforward horror was because critics were trying to name the sort of affect that these films had. In other words, this kind of ambiguous sense of feeling or sensation that the films could produce, which was oftentimes this kind of lingering sense of dread. And so critics were trying to, in some way, find some name that would encompass the feeling of these films. And of course, the feeling being partly generated by the style that the films have, this very minimalistic style. And so after that second chapter, where I'm basically looking at the critical debates between high-minded film critics and genre fans and so on over the applicability of these different terms, then the rest of the chapters basically start to look at the different themes in the films. So the third chapter is looking at themes around trauma, and using films like Hereditary, The Babadook, Goodnight Mommy, and looking at basically themes around the family and anxieties about family influences, and especially influences that sort of jump a generation. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue is that, in a sense, that's kind of what has happened with these films themselves. Like, we have this kind of influence from this older generation of art horror films and art films in general that has sort of skipped a generation and suddenly inhabited this upcoming group of films. And then from there, I sort of developed themes around gaslighting. I look at gaslighting as one of the reasons why these films can be so sort of disturbing to a lot of people, and looking at different ways that gaslighting can play out, whether that be in sort of gendered terms with films like Midsommar or The Invitation, or in racial terms with a film like Get Out. And then from there, I move into a couple of chapters about landscape. And so I look at the influence of films like The Shining, and even films like There Will Be Blood, which might not seem like a horror film, but it is sort of horrific in its own way. And looking at those as potential ways into thinking about how there's a lot of like very sparse, wild landscapes, almost sublime landscapes in a lot of these films. You don't have quite as much of, well, in some cases you have, as I mentioned before, the kind of claustrophobic Gothic interiors with the films around Lost, but then some of the other films are about these wide open spaces. So like horrors around the forest in films like The Witch or Hagazusa, or around the ocean in films like The Lighthouse. And then gradually I apply similar sorts of arguments to something like It Follows, and look at how you have this kind of sparse, depopulated, deindustrialized setting of Detroit as an urban setting that is also allowing for this sort of dread over what exactly is lurking there. And then I finally end the book by looking at more, I guess you could say, sort of spiritual or philosophical issues around characters who are trying to find some sort of transcendence above the human. So whether that's turning to spirituality or turning to the occult or turning to something that sort of gets beyond the sort of everyday human existence. So kind of existential themes in these films.
How many of these that you look at are also sci-fi, and how many are any of them sort of historic, set in some historical period?
Not many of them are sci-fi. I tried to sort of make them pretty squarely about horror films, although there are a couple examples where you sort of like toe pretty close to that line. So something like Under the Skin, where you have an extraterrestrial on Earth harvesting meat to send back off world, but it plays out very much like a horror film, like a body horror film in particular. So I didn't focus too much on some of the more sort of understated artsy sci-fi films that have been coming out around the same period of time. And as to the other part of the question, a few of them have historical settings, but most of them are pretty contemporary. So Robert Eggers' films are historical because he loves his historical verisimilitude. He loves creating very period accurate sets and settings with films like The Witch or The Lighthouse. You might also look at something like the film Under the Shadow, which is an interesting look back at the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. And that one tends to be, that one's set in a very realistic historical setting as well, although certainly not as far back as, something like The Witch. But yeah, it's sort of a grab bag. A lot of them are pretty contemporary, though, as far as their setting.
What countries are these films from?
Most of them are from the U.S., but there are some from the UK, from Canada, from Australia. But by and large, I'm looking mostly at kind of Anglo-American films. There are a few from like France also, but yeah, by and large, it's been an American trend.
And so maybe you've already touched on this in your answers, but the culture, the part of your title, your book title, the cultural part, is that part of what you've just been saying, or is there more that you haven't touched on yet?
Well, the idea of cultural elevation in the title is really this idea that these films have somehow been described by critics as elevated above, the average. That they're somehow seen as doing something a little more reputable than your typical horror film, and therefore they're easier horror films to take seriously, since after all, most professional film critics, not all, but many, tend to have sort of a skepticism about the horror genre. They tend to look down their nose at it. And these films, though, seem to be more easily reclaimable as like safe. Like they're aesthetically seemingly a cut above. And so as a result of that, critics have sort of like played up the value of these films, potentially at the expense of the genre as a whole. And so one of the things that you see genre fans very often do when they're trying to poke holes in all these labels like elevated horror or post horror and try to point out how all these labels are flawed, is that they'll very often say, well, yes, that's all fine and good to say that, okay, there are a handful of like reputable horror films that we can somehow elevate above the fray, but there's always been value in the horror genre, because as more of a sociological entity, horror has always been about addressing what society has repressed in some way or hasn't wanted to look at. And so to some degree, genre fans will make this counter argument and say, well, the horror genre doesn't need defending. It's always had value. It's just been seen as a disreputable genre because it delves into all of these themes that our society maybe doesn't want to address, without framing them in terms of being like about monsters and things like that.
Right. So when someone says highbrow, I usually think of things that are connected to some kind of literary basis or literary foundation, films that are, connected to, say, Pride and Prejudice or something. It's a film about a book that's renowned. And then I'm thinking a lot of horror films have been made out of Stephen King's works, that's based on books, and some of them are sort of lowbrow, some more highbrow. So I'm just curious about the connection of these modern films to any literary foundations.
A lot of these films that I'm looking at here aren't necessarily adapted from any existing literary source material. Some of them might have some influence. So like Robert Eggers draws influence from, say, Herman Melville when he's making a movie like The Lighthouse, or from the novels of Sarah Orne Jewett. But in general, these aren't necessarily adaptations of like highbrow literary source material, the way that you might have with like a prestige horror movie like Bram Stoker's Dracula or something like that. These films seem to be coming from somewhere else. They don't necessarily have that existing frame of reference for viewers. So that, I think, is another reason why they've been a little more controversial or a little more divisive. If you're going to see a new adaptation of Pride and Prejudice or Dracula or Frankenstein or something like that, you have a good idea what you're getting into on some level. But if you're going to see something like, It Follows or The Witch, where you're expecting there to be, something that's a little more generic there, and yet that kind of generic monster isn't really delivered to you in the way that you expect. It can leave people feeling kind of frustrated. Some people can feel sort of cheated. Like, why did I just sit through this 2-hour long movie about people moping around, acting depressed, if I'm not getting a bunch of scares at the end of the day?
Right. I'm speaking with David Church, author of Post Horror. You can find more information about his work at david-church.com. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. How many of the films in general have monsters versus have some other kind of dangerous element or, horror element?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of these films, if they do have monsters, the monster is depicted in a kind of indirect way, or we might only see like little fleeting glimpses of it.
Mm-hmm.
So in a movie like It Follows, for example, we get the fleeting glimpses of the monster, gradually marching toward the camera, but it's not really dwelt upon that much. Even in a movie like Hereditary, which is a little more sort of overtly supernatural, you do get some images of ghostly things happening, like the mother levitating and floating around and doing all sorts of spooky things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as front and center as it might be with, a movie where you have the monster just on screen for long periods of time chasing characters around, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
In some cases, though, there's a lot of hesitation in these films over like who the true monster is or if something supernatural really is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So in something like Get Out or in Midsommar, these films around like gaslighting themes, there's this question of, well, something seems off to the main character. Like something's not right in these circumstances and I can't quite put my finger on it and no one believes me that something is off. And I'm not really sure who to trust. And yet something monstrous does happen, but it's not monstrous in sort of a supernatural way. It's monstrous things that people are doing because of these belief systems that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, you find that with the themes or with the films that are themed around trauma. So lots of times films with traumatized characters, they are having these sort of delusions and breaks from reality. And they're not really sure, the home that they've lived in no longer feels like home to them. It feels like a strange, uncanny place. And they feel haunted by someone who, used to be part of their life, but is no longer there. And so you get all these things that might or might not be supernatural, but you're never really sure exactly whether it's within that person's head or whether there's something supernatural actually going on. And some of these films never really land squarely on one side of that line or another. Some of them just seem to kind of keep that hesitation going and never answer the question and kind of leave things totally ambiguous about whether something is truly supernaturally afoot. And as a result of that, then that's yet another reason why some of these films might feel disappointing for viewers. Like if you can never figure out like, oh, was there really a ghost or not? It's kind of like, the turn of the screw or something like that. You can read it different ways. Was the person crazy? Was there a ghost? How do we know? It could be read multiple ways.
Yeah. So considering these films have been coming out for 10 years or more after the U.S. has been in war against terrorism, and you have returning veterans and all that, do any of the films, in some of what you mentioned, maybe you answered this already, but how much are they influenced by the experiences of veterans in the country in terms of terrorism and all that, and the wars?
strangely, I think a lot of these films are not really engaging directly with the war on terror or with the legacy of that.
Mhm.
Um, there are some exceptions like Under the Shadow, which is really, about Middle Eastern wars, but framed from people living in the Middle East, people living in Tehran, but back in the 80s rather than, post 9/11.
Mhm.
Um, I don't see most of these films as dealing specifically with the legacy of 9/11 or the war on terror or domestic terrorism or things of that nature.
Mhm.
They seem to be almost a turn away from some of those themes that had been pretty prominent in the horror genre post 9/11.
Mhm.
So again, the so-called torture porn films that started to come out around 2004, 2005, movies like Saw and Hostel and Turistas, and movies where it was about um, Americans traveling abroad and becoming captured and tortured, or questions of someone randomly capturing you and torturing you, or doing terrible things to you, and that being seen as like a reflection of what was just sort of like floating around in the culture at that point in time. I don't
Mhm.
really see there being very much of that in these films.
Mhm.
Maybe the closest would be something like Goodnight Mommy,
Mhm.
where in the last third of that film, one of the the children ties up his mother and begins to torture her. But that's really sort of, I think, a kind of a transitional film.
Mhm.
It's one of the earliest of these post-horror films, and most of the other films that I'm looking at here don't have long scenes of characters being in captivity or being tortured or anything like that. Um, it's really about things that are happening in their own head.
And I ask because I've done some interviews with academics about Latin American horror, how
Mm.
that deals with sort of the politics of, totalitarian regimes and students being kidnapped and tortured and kept, imprisoned. It seems to reflect that, and I'm just curious if any of that is seen in U.S. horror.
Uh, I think because the context here, we don't necessarily have that floating around to the same degree that we do with Latin American horror films. It's just not going to come up in the genre as much. It's not going to be reflected as much in the genre as it might be in films coming from Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So tell me how you did the research for this book. I assume you watched the movies, and is it just sort of stuff your own experiences and understanding, or was there more?
Well, part of it was my own experience and my own little mini readings of the films, like things that I thought were interesting ways that certain themes came up again and again, or maybe interconnected with certain larger political issues, gaslighting and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
and how that could be read on like a larger cultural scale, especially during the Trump years, for example. Um, but beyond my own little readings of the films, I
Mm-hmm.
did a lot of research into the reception of the films themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at how film critics and genre fans talked about them, and basically looking at the discourse around them, that was a really important factor, because that way it wasn't only coming from my own personal readings of the films, my own interpretations, but I could engage with this larger conversation around the films and try to put more of a finger on why, even if I like the films a lot, why other people might have not liked them quite as much, or
Right.
why they might have rated them, much lower than, say, kind of a guaranteed crowd pleaser like the It movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So who or what critics were you reading from? Like, was it online reviews and, official newspaper reviews, or what would you choose from?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at um, a variety of stuff from, kind of reputable cultural arbiters of taste, the New York Times, the New Yorker. Richard Brody from the New Yorker was somebody whose name came up many times over the course of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also from the Guardian. So this guy Steve Rose, who's a columnist for the Guardian in the UK, is the one who coined this term post horror to begin with. And so looking at both American and British film critics, but then also American and British fans. And so looking at like um, magazines like Diabolique or websites like Rue Morgue or even Reddit, and basically looking at, okay, where are actual horror fans discussing these films amongst themselves, and how might their opinions differ from someone like Richard Brody, who's saying things like, oh, well, genre is sort of irrelevant. If you have material that's treated in a sort of elevated way by a talented filmmaker, it doesn't really matter what genre it's from, that sort of thing.
What what did what part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
Hmm. That's a good question.
I mean, I assume you enjoy watching the movies, but did it get to the point where you had to watch them over and over to the point where you were like, all right, enough of that?
Yeah. At some point, especially when I was writing about some of the post-apocalyptic movies, like right around the time that the COVID lockdown was starting, watching movies over and over, like It Comes at Night, where you have all these people locked inside because there's mysterious viruses out there, and of course, all these kind of like cabin fever type themes coming up again and again in the films. That was not terribly fun. But I liked reading up on a lot of stuff about the occult, which was something that I hadn't expected to kind of go in the direction of before. But some of the films like Hereditary, and especially this one called A Dark Song, are pretty interesting as far as the references to the occult that they are making use of. And even something like A Dark Song, I had to go in and read a bunch of these old medieval grimoires, like how to cast spells and how to perform these months-long occult workings, these long operations, and try to parse out, okay, what has been fictionalized for the film and what is actually true to supposedly what one can do with the occult and all that kind of stuff. So that was interesting, just because I hadn't really dipped my toes into some of that literature very much.
What did you come across that most surprised you? And nothing pops up. This is sort of like, that psychological test, like what's the first thing you think of when
Right.
you see this picture?
I mean, one of the things that struck me was just how stark of a divide there might be for some people watching these films, in terms of how some critics just absolutely adored them, and then how audiences absolutely hated them. So when I would actually go to watch some of these movies, especially in the theater, I was sometimes surprised by the number of walkouts that there were, which is something that you tend not to see in a lot of, more mainstream horror films, I guess. People are there for the entertainment value, and the fact that people were being off by these films, or being bored, or being frustrated and getting up and leaving. And sometimes I saw a couple of cases of people shouting at the screen as they were on their way out, with movies like Mother, for example, which is, it's a movie trashing religion. So you're probably going to get that response from some people, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, just seeing how stark the divide was over people's opinions on some of these films was, I thought, something that was endlessly fascinating, and something that kept me coming back to them. Because again, my opinions on most of these films were pretty high to begin with. I really liked these films, at least most of them. Yeah. But then seeing just like why a lot of other people absolutely hated them was really fascinating.
Have you seen, or do you expect to see, sort of big studio copycats of any of these films?
It's interesting because there have been some attempts on the publicity circuit for major studio films to try to label these as elevated horror films or post-horror films, even if stylistically they aren't really doing that. So, for example, when the remake of Pet Sematary came out a year or two ago, I guess it was 2 years ago now, the filmmakers were out on the publicity circuit saying, oh yeah, we wanted to make this elevated horror film. So they're using the same critical language to try to make it seem like their film is a cut above the rest, trying to raise it up in the public's esteem. But then when people actually went and saw the movie, they were like, oh, this is just your very typical generic movie filled with jump scares. It's this very predictable Stephen King movie, and of course people knew what they were getting into, because most people knew the story of Pet Sematary going in. So that was a case where these attempts by the filmmakers to kind of preemptively label it as a quote unquote elevated horror film or a post horror film really flopped. just because the material itself wasn't stylistically elevated. It wasn't as minimalistic. It wasn't as disturbing. It wasn't as, austere as what you see with some of the, I guess we could call actual elevated horror films.
So it sounds like they just made a movie to please the standard crowd. But yeah, as you said, using the language to maybe draw in the more sophisticated crowd, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
And you can also see something similar with a movie like Us, Jordan Peele's Us.
Mm-hmm.
That's a movie where, when he put out Get Out, he initially said, well, Get Out isn't a horror film, Get Out is a social thriller. So he described it as a social thriller instead of a horror film, at least at first.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, he said, well, no, Get Out is actually a documentary because it was seemingly so close to the truth of Black people's experience.
Mm-hmm.
But then when Us came around, his follow-up film, he flat out said, like, Us is a horror film. Mm-hmm. It's not not a thriller. It's not this, not that. There was no no mincing of words about things. He just flat out said it's a horror film. So it was like he was trying to make a corrective from how he had earlier characterized Get Out as a social thriller or as something else.
Okay.
But what was kind of interesting there is that, some people went in and saw Us and were a little disappointed by it, or at least disappointed by it compared to Get Out. They didn't think of it quite measured up in the same way. They thought it was maybe tonally a little all over the place. It was maybe mashing together too much, Twilight Zone influence with too much kind of comedy and too much of this, that, and the other, and didn't really all come together for them. It didn't feel like as coherent of a film as Get Out did. And so that would be a case where some people even said, well, Peele was under so much pressure from having made, this landmark film before this, how are you going to follow that up? And maybe he was under so much pressure to make something that was seemingly elevated that there were there were too heavy of critical expectations put on him for that sophomore film of his.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how you have critics debate these films and come up with terms, and then studio publicists and marketing start to co-opt them for their own purposes, and it's just kind of fascinating watching that happen.
Yeah. And then of course when fans intervene and try to say like, well, I'm actually going to call it this, or I absolutely refuse to call it a elevated horror film. I'm just going to call it a horror film or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think fans love to argue, fans of any genre, and just giving them more excuses to argue about something. I think just, yes, they get mad and annoyed, but I think it also is exciting for them to keep it going.
It is, yeah. And that I think is one of the things that has really fascinated me about this body of films, is that they've generated so much discussion, and not just among critics, but also fans. And there's been this kind of maelstrom of discussion around them, over people debating, like, are the films worthy of all this buzz? Should they just be seen as part of the larger genre? Should they be seen as somehow like actually art house dramas instead of horror films? Like, people are constantly debating the merits of these films, and a lot of it comes back to the labels that get applied to them in the first place. But I really like this quote that the critic Matt Zoller cites, posted on Twitter. He says, elevated horror is like an artisanal cheeseburger. Make the goddamn cheeseburger. If it's delicious, no one will care what adjective you put in front of it. So, certainly some film critics are saying, like, if it's a quality product, it doesn't matter like what you call it. It's going to find its audience one way or another.
Mm-hmm. How about, did you come across any horror films that were made sort of, I guess this would definitely be experimental or art house, where they deliberately were trying to frustrate the audience, where they were like, here's my horror and you're going to hate it, but I don't care because, it does what I want to do. It's subversive or something like that.
Right. I think some of the films that A24 has put out have been marketed as if they were horror films but then they end up being something very different when you actually go see them. So something like a ghost story is much more about like, wandering across this, cosmic fields across time and space, and about grief and mourning and all this kind of stuff. And there's like very, very little that actually resembles a horror film in it. Even down to the monster himself is, just this guy underneath a white sheet for the whole film. But in some cases, I think a movie like Darren Aronofsky's Mother was deliberately made to be sort of a rebuke to the audience. You had a major star, Jennifer Lawrence, and other big name stars, Javier Bardem, Ed Harris, Michelle Pfeiffer, big names in it. And yet it's a film that is a very thinly veiled allusion to the Bible, to Genesis and the Gospels, and is at the same time trying to be an attack on Judeo-Christian beliefs. So a film like that's deliberately trying to be, it's deliberately trying to be obscure, but at the same time being so blatant as far as trying to kind of like poke people in the eye as far as attacking their religious beliefs. That I think is one of the few where it was pretty deliberate on the filmmaker's part to make something that was going to be hated by a large chunk of the audience.
Was there did you come across any issue or anything within the research for this book that was particularly difficult for you to get an answer to, and either you did figure it out or you're like, I still wish I understood X or Y?
That's a good question. I mean, at some point I kind of had to draw a line in the sand and say, like, I can't come to any like final judgments about these films, because I think the cycle is still ongoing at the moment. We have movies like Amulet, or She Dies Tomorrow, or Saint Maud, still coming out as of this past year. And so I wasn't able to fit them into the book. And so one of the questions that I'm still left with is, how much longer is this cycle going to go? Is this going to be a continuing trend in the genre? Is it something that's going to sort of like burn itself out by, roughly the decade mark, which I guess would be coming up in a couple years? Or is it, something that's just going to be sort of like a perennial thing? So for me, I had to at some point just kind of step back from the project and say, I can go no further here. I need to just basically say, here's where things are at as of this time of writing, and I don't know exactly where things are going to go 5 years from now, 10 years from now. If I were writing a follow-up book to this, I would, I'm sure, have a longer, I would have more historical perspective to be able to say, like, okay, here's where this cluster of films fits into the wider genre. But I'm, simply not at that point yet.
Was there, I forget that Korean film, that Korean horror that got all this buzz a couple years ago. I'm totally blanking on the title. I don't know if you included it in your study.
Which one was that? Was it Train to Busan?
No, it was, what was it about? I'm pretty sure it was a horror film. This Korean one that everyone was like, wow, this is totally different. And I mean, it got so much buzz. I'm pretty sure it was a horror movie.
It wasn't Parasite.
Oh, Parasite. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't focus on Parasite in here. I felt like it was almost a little too far away from a horror film, although it certainly does have horror elements in it in its last act.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. That was a random thought there. So was there, and maybe this research doesn't lend itself to this question, but was there anything that had a strong emotional impact that you came across, either positively or negatively?
I think the circumstances of just seeing a few of these films at the moment when I was watching them had kind of an unexpected impact. So, watching, as I mentioned before, watching It Comes at Night multiple times right after the COVID lockdown had started, and thinking, okay, that's ironic, but an interesting coincidence, if nothing else, but nonetheless sort of made it that much more difficult to sit through in some sense, but more relevant to sit through. Or even something like Midsommar. So right at the time that Midsommar came out in early July of 2019, I guess it was, I had just accepted a job to move from Arizona out to Indiana.
Mm.
And so this was a very rushed move. And so, I just felt like I was uprooting myself at the last minute and having to relocate myself completely over the course of about a month. And so, that was a very distressing movie to watch just because I was feeling very distressed at the time I was watching it.
Mm.
Um, but I think it depends on just like who you are and what you're going through at the time that you're watching these movies. Again, these movies are not necessarily horror movies for escapism or horror movies for entertainment's sake.
Mm.
These are movies that delve into, themes around grief and loss and existential crisis and dread and all these different sorts of things that are not necessarily fear, but they're other like negative emotions, negative affects.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you were going through a breakup or if you were in the midst of a bad relationship and going to see a movie like Midsommar, that might be a tough movie to sit through. Then again, it might be a very cathartic movie at the end based upon your own personal response to it.
Mm-hmm.
Even a company like A24, when they put out the director's cut of Midsommar, they sort of had this tongue-in-cheek contest where they said, hey, do you need couples therapy after you watch this film? We will give away this, you can win a subscription to 3 months of couples therapy, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it all just kind of depends. Watching a movie like Get Out amid all of the racial turmoil and, it obviously being a film that's directly responding to Black Lives Matter and everything that we've seen in that regard over the last couple of years. That's something that also makes it, a more difficult watch, or could be a much more emotionally draining watch for some people rather than others.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when I've taught that film before, I've had some people in the class who said, we don't want to watch the original director's cut, the one where the main character, Cris, is not victorious at the end, the one where he goes to jail at the end. And a lot of students said, we know that ending, that alternate ending exists, we just don't want to see it. We want the more escapist ending, the more upbeat ending, the one that has some shred of optimism at the end, rather than the one where he remains basically trapped in the prison industrial complex as this alternate version of the sunken place.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I think to be able to talk about what it means to make those sorts of creative choices and, why Peele decided to go with the more optimistic ending versus the more pessimistic ending, is, yet another reason why I think the emotional impact that these films can have on audiences can be really, really fraught and really divisive.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned A24 a lot. Are there other studios like them putting out horror films, interesting horror films?
Not as many putting out the films that I'm looking at here. I mean, Blumhouse has been putting out a lot of interesting horror films, lots of really influential horror films over the last 10 years. So they really helped to get the found footage cycle off the ground. They helped to do a lot of the paranormal themed films that have been so popular over the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. So, they have the Conjuring franchise, they have the Purge movies. They have been doing a lot of interesting stuff with more sort of supernatural things, but then also social commentary as well. Mm-hmm. But a lot of their films are not necessarily the same ones that I'm talking about in this post-horror book. There are a few exceptions, though. Get Out is one. And that, I think, is because Get Out is a little more stylistically attuned to the Hollywood style. It's not as much of a departure as, stylistically speaking, as some of the stuff that A24 puts out, for example. Mm-hmm. So Get Out was a little more accessible in that regard, which is probably one of the reasons why, of probably all of the post-horror films, it was the one that had the biggest concurrence between the critical reception and the popular reception. Most people really loved it and thought it was an important and interesting film. Mm-hmm. But the A24 ones seem to be much more willing to be divisive and to be made really for the art house fans, despite the fact that they're managing to get their film shown in multiplexes and therefore getting a broader audience who might not necessarily know what they're getting into if they're, watching the film or watching the trailer and simply see the A24 logo come up. But other than that, the trailer is making it seem as if it's a much more generic film.
So what do you hope this book will do for readers?
Well, I hope this book will provide a useful way in to talking about these films, because there's been so much discussion about the films and so many of these little critical versus fan versus popular debates about the merits of the individual films and the various efforts to label the films as something, that I'm hoping this book will be a useful way to sort of like step back and say, okay, here's the longer history of the horror genre. Here's where these films fit, as far as they're not necessarily doing anything brand new. There have always been these sort of art house, minimalistic horror films, but we've had this concentrated cluster of them coming out over the last couple of years that have gotten a lot more mainstream exposure. Hence the fact that there's been all of this discussion around them. And so really I'm trying to provide readers with some way into understanding the critical debates around them, the style of the films, and then also some of the recurring themes. But I certainly don't pretend that this book is exhaustive. I mean, these movies they're dense, they're complex. This book is certainly not intended to be in any way the final word on any of these films, especially since, the cycle is still ongoing as we speak.
What are you working on currently?
Currently, I'm doing a book that's a little bit of a departure. It's a history of the Mortal Kombat video game franchise. And so that should be out either late this year or early next year. And it's basically a little short book, mostly focused on the years 1992 through 95. So basically the moment when the first 3 games came out and became really controversial, when there were all the congressional hearings around video game violence, when they were sort of marking this transition from games in the coin-op arcade to games that could be reproduced on 16-bit home systems like the Sega Genesis, and just kind of looking at what went on with that whole moment in time.
And now we have Grand Theft Auto 5 or whatever it's on now, where if you want to talk about violence in video games.
I know, yeah. Everything that's out there now has completely outpaced anything that Mortal Kombat had done back then, even including in the most recent Mortal Kombat games, of which there was one that came out just, the latest one a few months ago.
Yeah. Okay. So where can people find you online? Do you have social media or website to follow your thoughts or updates?
I have a website. It's just david-church.com. And that's just my personal website. Okay. And other than that, you can also find some of my work at academia.edu if you search for my name. And you should be able to find me there.
Okay. And that's David Church, the standard spelling.
Yeah.
For the listeners, all right, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
Not that I can think of offhand. I mean, the book itself is really expensive right now just because it's only out in hardback. There will be a less expensive paperback edition coming out in early of next year. And in the meantime, people might be able to find the book through their libraries, if they have a university library or just a local library near them. Or also the ebook version you can find through JSTOR and Project Muse and some of those databases.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Thanks. In the next episode, I speak with well-known science fiction author Andy Weir about his new novel. Space Dock the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.